What are transients? Transients are the short bursts of energy that you hear at the start of any sound. The loudest of transients are things like drum hits, where the crack of the stick on a drum head sends a loud sound to the microphone. Transients are everywhere though, from the pick attack on your guitar, strings, to the consonants of your vocal. Ever used a pop filter while recording? The main goal of a pop filter is to catch plosives, which are loud bursts of air into the microphone, much like transients. So everything has a transient, a snare, piano, sound of a human voice, everything has a transient, and they are not necessarily frequency specific. Today I'm going to show you probably the most versatile tool in terms of capturing this transient material. It's called SPIFF. They call it an adaptive transient tool that cuts or boosts only the frequencies that make up the transient material, keeping the rest of the audio signal intact. And why this is important is because nothing else can do what SPIFF does. Most transient shapers in the marketplace are going to do a fine job of increasing the transient content of the signal, but if you're using this on a summing bus or on a master, then this is a moot point because you cannot be specific with a tool like this. In other words, if I have, let's say, a loop or a summing bus with all of my drums, and I just want to treat the snare with a typical envelope or transient shaper, I simply will get lost in the muddy waters. A plugin like SPIFF affords me the opportunity to get very specific with the signal. Let me show you by way of illustration. I'm going to play a kick snare pattern here, and you're going to hear a very lackluster performance. And as soon as I start to specifically detail which part of those transients I would like to display in a grander way, then you'll start hearing the excitement that can very much be associated with using SPIFF. This is just one example of many, by the way. On the right-hand side, I will be using a secondary player called Shope, simply to meter the transient information. Check it out. So like I said, nothing special, but by means of SPIFF, utilizing not cut, but the boost faculty, I will now add a little bit more excitement here. Check it out. Now, it's important that you just don't hear what's happening. Look at Shope, the meter on the right-hand side, okay? Because what really is occurring here is that we're adding very specific transient information. How it's doing this, we're about to find out. But again, this is before, and this is after. All right, let's get right into it. SPIFF was originally designed to attenuate or remove sharp clicks, such as mouth noises on vocal recordings. These clicks could be a byproduct of excessive compression, treble boost, bad microphone choice, or just an unwanted part of the performance. SPIFF has been carefully tweaked to work well on vocal tracks as it introduces minimal artifacts, leaving the rest of the signal intact. Thanks to this, it turned out to be an equally useful tool on almost any sound source. I would say this to be true on a guitar, on drums, arpeggiated synths, anything really. Sky is the limit with a tool of this nature. Of course, they want you to read the manual, but they have provided a quick start guide, and this is what we're going to use just to get started. It says here that when you have added SPIFF to a channel with audio material, you want to start by turning on delta, and then you want to turn up the depth in order to hear what SPIFF is reacting to. After that, you want to decide if you want to cut or boost this. So I'm going to go ahead and boost. We'll turn on delta. Let's hear that which we're affecting. Okay, remember the signal is starting to add transient content. All right, after that, we're going to adjust the sensitivity and decay controls until we have focused on the part of the transient that we want to control. So let's play with sensitivity and decay. So this kind of reminds me of the ratio knob in a compressor. I'm not saying that's what it does, but just based on my first experience of it, it's obviously giving you more information as you're increasing the sensitivity, because you can dial in exactly how much you want to add or subtract. Let's see what decay does. So this is going to be a different experience depending on if you have cut or boost selected. In the case of boost, you're starting to hear the material come into play. In this case, I'm boosting it. And so a decay is very much like a release in a compressor. It's essentially not going to let go of the signal as it usually would. In the same way here, if decay is all the way up, you're basically just hearing all of the signal or all of the treatment. So this here gives it time to get back to normal, to hear some of the movement and some of the magic. All right, so then now I have this dialed in. If you're using cut, this is a different experience altogether. So delta is still on. Let's listen to it here. So this will be information that you are cutting when delta is not on, of course. So this could be a very, very creative experience for some. While you're using boost, it can really add a lot of energy and excitement. And then if you're using cut, you can become a bit more clinical and surgical with your approach. Here, check it out. Yeah, so that's pretty intense how that's working. All right, let's go back to this state here. It says that we can use the sidechain EQ to filter out frequencies that we don't want to process or boost frequencies that we do want to process. So in the case of this gray and light blue node, we are essentially determining what we are going to treat. So none of this is adding to the signal. Like if I take this purple parametric EQ node, I'm not adding, I'm just telling the plugin, hey, we can add more information here, or I'd like to boost more of this, I'd like to work on more of this, but you're not necessarily adding to the signal. So in the same way, we can remove content so we can focus on the high mids or just the highs. Let's go ahead and play with that. So you can hear how the lower kick has been omitted from the signal. And let's bring it back into the fold. Okay, after that, you want to adjust sharpness and decay to taste. They can often be left to default value. So right below sensitivity and decay, we have two other parameters, which of course will work in tandem with all the rest of these. Sharpness tends to sound more natural in a lower setting, and the higher values can be useful for rich and polyphonic sound sources. We're talking pianos, acoustic instruments. All right, let's set this down to 0. To my ears, it sounds like we're just further dialing in exactly how much transient behavior we would like to modify. And then in terms of decay between high and low frequencies, it says lower values are going to shorten the decay time toward higher frequencies. and vice versa. If this is set in the center, decay times are equal at all frequencies. So let's hear what this sounds like. Well, we definitely hear that it's coloring the signal and favoring it either on the higher spectrum or the lower spectrum. So this is very much a color knob. Let's make this a little bit brighter for our purposes. All right, and then following through with this exercise, it says that you should turn off delta monitoring and then adjust the depth again. All right, so we're going to turn off delta. Let's play with depth. Now, please remember, I started here. Now, it's pretty scary that that much progress can be made with a couple of dials and not a lot of knowledge about the plugin. I just started reading this, so that's pretty spectacular. All right, you're going to want to bypass to hear what SPIFF has added, removed, and then after that, you want to trim the output signal to match the original volume. Of course, when using deep processing like this, it's not a bad idea to use a little makeup gain to clear up the signal. So let's try this out. Yeah, I'm loving this plugin already. It's really magical, everything it's doing to the signal. Okay, so they give you a couple of rules of thumb, which I always appreciate. I love it when manufacturers give you some recommendations. Obviously, they built the plugin, so they do have a lot to say, and they are the final authority on it. It says here, when cutting, a good rule of thumb is to place SPIFF as the last insert of the channel for smoothest results. And then, of course, when boosting, SPIFF usually works best early in the signal chain before any compressors or limiters. So depending on how you're using this, you're either going to want to place this on the end of the channel for smoother results when you are cutting. And of course, if you're boosting, go ahead and put this earlier on in the chain before any compressors, limiters, or saturators. All right, let's move on to cut and boost modes. Now we're going to get specific to the plugin. What does everything do? How can I control it? How can I utilize it? To be clear, SPIFF can be used to either cut or boost transient material. These cuts or boosts are applied on frequencies that form the transients. That's where this plugin thrives. Nothing else can do what this specifically does. So if you apply SPIFF to a kick drum, it won't boost the boxy frequencies around 300 unless there is actually transient information at 300 hertz. All right, let's talk about the largest of the knobs. Depth determines how much of the processing is being applied. More depth results in bigger cuts or boost. SPIFF is input level independent as mentioned, so you can put it anywhere in your signal chain and it will always work according to the depth value, regardless of the gain stage, and you gotta love that. Sensitivity is going to detect the transients. Higher values means that it's going to detect more transients. This is set a little bit lower. It means that it's only going to detect the loudest of transients. Easy to remember as more or less sensitive. For corrective use in the cut mode, you might want to set this value pretty low. All right, there's another one of the tips by the developers. The best way to hear what sensitivity does is to first enable the delta mode and then crank the depth and then adjust the sensitivity to taste. I agree. I really like using it like that. So let's go ahead and try this out by means of cut and turning on delta. Here we go. I'm just blown away because this plugin is taking away all of the transients and I can still hear everything with full fidelity. It's really, really amazing. All right, let's continue on here. Sharpness is going to control the bandwidth of all the separate cuts or boost. So the lower values are going to sound more natural on percussive material, while the higher values are going to work well on harmonic material with a wide frequency range. So if we're dealing with mostly percussion, let's play in the lower regions. If not, we will go up. We are dealing with percussion now, so let's see how this sounds. Let me go ahead and boost this. Absolutely incredible. All right, let's move on to Decay. First, the time it takes for a cutter boost to recover back to its starting point. Kind of like a release, as I mentioned. A higher value means longer decay time back to the initial level. If you set this to 0, it's only going to be a very short part of the transient that will be adjusted. Increasing the decay applies more processing to the tail after the initial transient. For most practical use cases, looks like a value lower than 5 produces the most natural results. Again, if you don't do that, basically it's just holding down the signal if using cut and then just pushing it almost like an upward expander in terms of a multiband compressor if you're holding it down that way. There is a disclaimer here. Higher values can be very useful for creative abuse. So take that as you will. All right. Decay for low and high frequency. This is used to adjust the relative difference in decay time between low and high frequencies. Lower value means the low frequencies have a longer decay. Higher values mean higher frequencies take longer to recover than low frequencies. In the center, the decay time is equal across the whole frequency range. Values lower than 5 tends to sound the most transparent. So regardless how we translate that, I know this is going to color the signal significantly. So when you're making your adjustments, just be careful that this is definitely going to make its mark on your sound. So we've talked about the main parameters. Let's talk about the graph and the EQ. Now this is not an EQ in the traditional sense. It can be thought of better as a meter or as leveling tools to help you specifically decipher that which you want to affect. All right, so SPIFF uses a real-time graph to show you what part of the signal is being processed. Frequencies being affected can be controlled with the EQ section. Please note, this is not actually an EQ, but rather a weighting for the processing. You can think of it as a side chain EQ, filtering out the frequencies that you specifically want to work on. Dragging a band upwards increases the relative amount of processing, right? Makes it more sensitive so that you can hit those frequencies in a deeper way. By using the high and low pass filters, you can make SPIFF ignore the areas above and below the specific frequencies. If you don't need to hit the low end, then of course, similar to many other plugins, you can just take the detection filters and remove any and all low end. This GUI is so beautiful. I could spend so much time looking at it. Of course, on the lower right-hand side, we have the ability to resize it. All right, so SPIFF has 5 bands that allow you to control these EQ detectors. You can choose a band by clicking on the corresponding node. Adjust the band parameters by dragging the nodes or by using the parameter knobs below. You can adjust the width of a band by holding a modifier key. For Mac users, we're using Command. All right, so click on the EQ node, either purple, yellow, or red, or you can go ahead and click on the light blue or gray are basically the high and low pass detectors. And another way to control these is by means of these parameters. You don't necessarily have to do it one way or another. And if you would like to adjust the slope, there's two ways of doing it. You can hold your trackpad, your mouse, hold command, and then just start to scroll accordingly. It's very specific. I personally like using the 2-finger gesture on a trackpad. Just gives me a little bit more flexibility, and quite frankly reminds me of the Q3, which I really have grown to love and use quite a bit. Please remember that this is not an EQ per se, and you're essentially just helping the plugin detect the information that you wish to process. So as mentioned, red, yellow, and purple bands can be set to parametric shelf or tilt shelf mode as indicated by these symbols. Okay, so that's your band pass, that's your tilt, and there's your tilt shelf mode. You can set the slope in decibels of the gray and light blue filters from the controls below. Multiple bands may be selected for editing by either dragging a box around the nodes or by holding shift. So let's say I want to make changes to the red, yellow, and purple parametric controls. Apparently, if I hold shift all the while, I can perhaps drag them all down together, bring them up. That's pretty sweet. Let's continue on. You want to bypass a band, you can double click on the node, and you can also click on band 1. So for example, if I double click on that, we've now essentially turned off this specific band. If we want to turn it on again, we can. That's one way of doing it. You can also just simply click on band 1, and that will essentially render it useless for the moment until you bring it back. All right, we can actually listen to these bands, which is really, really nice. Two ways of doing that. We can click on listen here, start to play with the slope to hear exactly what we're affecting. Another thing we can do is simply hold Option on the Mac and click and hold, and that should get us there as well. Quick workflow tip: if you go into the gear icon on the top right, you can also have this auto band listen. That's not the way I have it set up, but it is a pretty sweet feature. But again, if you option click, it's pretty natural as well. As soon as you do get into this auto band listen mode, you can let go of option. All right, let's continue on here. The output stage lets you adjust the monitoring and levels. With the mix parameter, you can combine the original dry signal together with the processed one. You could, for example, apply heavy processing with SPIFF and then mix some of the dry signal back in. Let's try that with this signal. Now, this makes for a much more natural sound. You got to remember, this is where we started. So yeah, it sounds about 1 billion times better, doesn't it? With wet on 100%, only the process signal gets to the output. Of course, you can start blending that to taste. Trim. It's a makeup gain control for the process signal to compensate for any changes in loudness. I already used this before. Sometimes you will need to make up for some of the loss. In this case, I'm boosting, so probably not as irrelevant. Let's try cutting really quick. All right, so you can hear that's fairly aggressive, especially if I raise this up to 100%. Here's before. And so because of that loss of volume, shaving off so much of that transient content, we're going to lift up trim. Now, I do think this particular song sounds a lot better with boost. So let me just try going back to cut with the entire mix. Yeah, that's a bit of a cleanup job there. Pretty cool. All right, we talked about delta. It's going to toggle the difference between the signal that is wet and that which is dry. This is useful for monitoring the part of the signal that SPIFF is affecting. With this, you can get an insight into what SPIFF is reacting to and adjusting accordingly. So in this case, this is what we're working with. We're utilizing cut. Let's see what this sounds like here. Now, the only reason I brought this all the way up is because, as it says here, higher values can be useful for rich and polyphonic sound sources. I know this is an entire song, so I was thinking that might be a good move for master processing. All right, looks like we can bypass toggle. They're calling this a soft bypass for quick A/B comparison without glitches. Please note that SPIFF continues to compute the output, so bypassing with this control won't save you any processing power. To disable the plugin, you should always deactivate it from the host. So basically saying, hey, if this plugin is instantiated, regardless if it's bypassed or not, you will be using it. So make sure to omit it from the session, remove it altogether. It looks like we can also use this in stereo and mid side. When running this in stereo, SPIFF can control the link of the two channels, left and right. Stereo mode determines if you control the left and right channels separately or the mid and side channels separately. Stereo link right below that is basically going to combine the sidechain signals and apply the same reduction for both channels. If it's set to 100%, if you set it to 0%, it's going to make SPIFF act as two mono instances. And when you do that, it's going to react differently than if you had this set to 100%. You will get varying results depending on which mode you set this. When using balance, this is going to refer to the amount of processing applied to each channel, either adjusted to just the left, just the right, just the middle, or just the sides. Let me give you an example of that. If we go back to this song and I want to increase particularly the snare and clap sound, well, I probably don't want to use left, right, because usually the kick snare pattern can be found in mid side processing. And so then what I'll do here is I'll make sure that most of my attention is on mid only. Of course, it doesn't have to be all the way, but just by way of example, let's go ahead and try this out. All right, I'll turn on delta, try and locate specifically the snare, and then we'll go from there. So I'm actually quite happy with that. Let me play with sharpness. Yeah, remember for sharpness, the rule of thumb is lower values tend to sound more natural. And I remember reading up there somewhere that it's better for percussion in general. So that sounds pretty good. We might have to use a little bit of the mix or blend knob here. Let's see what this sounds like. Now, bear in mind, if we have set this over to stereo, it's going to sound different than that. Check it out. Now it's touching on everything. not just the snare. There's a lot of other information, hi-hats, things of that nature. So the fact that they give you this incredible feature is great. Let me show you the same processing that we used here. And I will turn this all the way up so we're only hitting side processing. If you look at Shope on the right-hand side, you can see what I'm saying, right? If I'm in mid mode, look at the way those transients are responding. All right, and if we switch this over to side, doesn't really have a chance. Okay, so this really does give you an incredible amount of control. Let's see what we can do with the advanced parameters available on SPIFF. If you need more fidelity, then on the default configuration, you can add oversampling and resolution to the process. Of course, this is going to utilize more CPU processing, so let's just get that out of the way. It says here, as a rule of thumb, the default settings are probably fine for individual tracks. You want to bounce those to audio, of course. You can evaluate this easily with the delta toggle. Resolution determines the time resolution of the processing. With increased resolution, SPIFF updates its internal settings more often. Oversample is going to calculate the reduction filter in higher resolution, resulting in a smoother frequency response and better accuracy. Please note that for both of these, you have extremely high demand on the CPU. Now, there's another window that we should take into account. So obviously, when you're rendering, let's say this is on a master, you should set this to the high settings. But of course, when you go back to just your normal day-to-day stuff, just set that back to 0. But there is another setting which we should take into account, and it's called window. It sets the trade-off between time and frequency resolution. So let's read a little bit more about this and when should we use it. Looks like short is best for click removal. Long is best for complex and polyphonic sources, whereas the medium setting is a good generic setting. So it says here, the small window has minimal ringing and it's great for fast transients. Check. As a trade-off, it has a worse lower frequency handling. So if you're doing something like de-essing or working with mouth sounds, clicks, things of that nature, you're going to want to set this to small window. Okay? Very transparent cut settings. It's good for that kind of stuff. When you're using large window, this is going to sound a lot smoother. Will really shine on polyphonic, complex sources of master, piano, acoustic instruments. Again, medium window is basically a trade-off between both of those. And so if you're not sure what to do, just stay in medium when utilizing this plugin, and that is phase mode. We have two modes that we can look at: linear phase and minimum phase. Linear phase is recommended for surgical cuts. Right? I told you at the beginning of this video that we can use this in a very calculated way, but also we can use this in a very creative way to supplement a mix. So if you use this in combination with small window, then that's a great fit. Linear phase, small window, great fit. Surgical application. As it happens, linear phase may introduce audible pre-ring, especially if you're using this for low frequencies. You're not supposed to be using it for low frequencies. That's clinical stuff right there, okay? Minimum phase eliminates that pre-ring, but it's better for boost. Often sounds more natural. Of course, it's going to be a little less accurate. That's okay, though, because it's a bit heavier on the CPU. And so they really have different purposes. I'm using this on a master, so minimum is the perfect mode, right? Sounds more natural. So something that I like to do to remind myself of all this stuff is either create some type of mind map, create a page on Evernote, or sometimes I'll save settings to remind myself of what to use and when to use it. So just throwing that out there. Preset menu. So much that you could do in here. They really beef this up with a lot of different settings. We can search for presets. We can start with a default. So that's always nice if you find something that you really like. So let's say we want to click on here. We want to search for acoustic guitars. There you go. Why don't we search for synth? Nothing there. What about bass? All right. So great little search engine. We can set something to default. Load presets. What else? All right, you can import presets. You can group various presets to create folders. Now, this is an interesting feature. Undo, redo. Let's say I make 5 choices right now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I have the ability to use this undo button inside of the plugin. Now, it's recommending that if we are redoing or undoing in the plugin, that we don't use our DAW, in this case Logic's specific way of undoing steps inside of a plugin. So if you're going to do this, do not use the DAW system. It says here, might yield unexpected results, especially when using together with A/B states. All right, let's talk about A/B switching. Looks like we can go back and forth between one setting and another. So as to be expected, we have an A/B switch, but we also have an A/B copy, which essentially takes the settings on one of your states and copies it to the other. So that's pretty cool. I haven't seen that in a plugin before. So if we want to copy this to B, we click on that one time, and then now we have all the same parameters and settings on the next window. All right. We've got a help menu as well, right? Displays the manual, shortcuts, the website, and there's a configuration menu that should not be avoided. So let's click on that. All right, let's talk about the disable OpenGL graphics. It says here, the OpenGL graphics mode is the fastest and prettiest option for most computer setups. So it comes default this way. Disabling it is intended as a fallback feature for people that cannot handle the CPU processing. So if you need a little bit of help, your computer's getting overwhelmed, you might want to disable OpenGL graphics. I like the tooltip. I'm going to leave that on. Again, I talked to you about this auto band listen mode. It says here that when it's enabled, band listen mode will automatically turn on when dragging one of the EQ nodes. This is useful if you always want to hear the delta or dry signal when moving EQ nodes around to know exactly which frequencies your change is affecting. This other setting, which I have on as well, it says here, by default, SPIFF will output the delta signal of a band's frequency range when band listen mode is engaged. When this setting is enabled, however, the dry signal will be passed through instead. So it just depends on how you like to work. I specifically want to listen to the dry signal. So when you enter into band listen, are you going to listen to that which delta is processing, or are you going to listen to the dry signal? I personally would like to listen to the dry signal, but let's go ahead and check this out. Let me disable that. So in the case of this specific EQ node, let's listen to this band. So again, we're listening to delta at that point, but if I go back in here and I enable this, now we're listening to the dry signal. You can change the range of the graph inside of this menu. So if you want a finer view, you can go ahead and set that up. And of course, if you want to check for the latest and the greatest, make sure you have the latest version of this plugin. They are currently on version 1.3.2. It says here, updates are provided for good reasons, such as bug fixes and performance improvements, and we always ensure that presets are backward compatible for all SPIFF versions to come. We take great care to procure that things don't break between updates. I can very much see that. This company has absolutely done something special by creating SPIFF, what they call an adaptive transient processor. Very remarkable plugin. Nothing out there like it in the market. And so I just want to salute OEK for putting out something absolutely incredible. I hope all modern creatives check out this plugin and they utilize it in their music productions today. All right, team, this is Eddie Gray signing off on behalf of hfmusicacademy.com and resourcesforthemoderncreative.com. Wishing you the very best. Stay up, stay happy, stay focused on what you want, and I will catch you guys on the next video. Cheers.